I didn't plan on being in Blackwood, Pennsylvania on New Year's Eve. And if the storm hadn't rolled in with such sudden violence, if my GPS hadn't lost signal right as the road narrowed into unfamiliar backcountry, and if my phone battery hadn't dipped below 10% at the exact moment I needed it most, I would have been cruising down the interstate, warm and bored and thinking about nothing more important than how late my sister would stay up waiting for me in Ohio. Instead, at exactly 11:12 p.m. on December 31st, my headlights cut through thick snowfall and illuminated a rusted metal sign leaning at an unnatural angle, half buried in snowdrifts as though the earth itself were trying to reclaim it, and the words etched into its corroded surface read, "Welcome to Blackwood, founded 1798. The letters faded and pitted with age, yet somehow unmistakably clear in the harsh glare of my headlights. The moment my car passed that sign, the radio went silent. Not fading, not dissolving into static or interference, but dead in a way that felt deliberate, as if someone had reached into the dashboard and cut the sound cleanly at the source. And I remember twisting the volume knob again and again, tapping the radio faceplate, scanning through stations that should have existed but didn't, until all that remained was the low hum of my engine and the soft, deliberate sound of snow striking the windshield in slow, measured taps. The silence pressed in on me so heavily that I became acutely aware of my own breathing, of the way my hands tightened on the steering wheel, of how isolated I suddenly felt despite being surrounded by buildings and roads that should have meant civilization. And I remember thinking how strange it was that a town could feel emptier than the open highway I had left behind. Blackwood wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a shortcut through rural Pennsylvania that shaved a couple of hours off my drive. But as my car rolled deeper into town, the beam of my headlights began to reveal rows of houses, old and closely packed, their exteriors worn by decades of harsh winters. And yet, every single one of them was lit from within. Not with the warm, uneven glow of lamps or holiday decorations, but with the same harsh white light that poured from every window like something clinical and exposed. There were no cars parked along the streets, no pedestrians, no laughter drifting from open doors or bars, no fireworks cracking in the distance as there had been in every other town I'd passed through that night. And the absence of sound was so complete that it felt artificial, like someone had muted the world just as I entered it. As I drove slowly past the first row of houses, an uneasy sensation settled in my chest, a pressure that made it difficult to take a full breath, because the windows weren't just illuminated, they were uncovered, every curtain pulled wide open as if privacy had been intentionally discarded, and I found myself leaning closer to the windshield, my breath fogging the glass as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Inside one of the houses stood a family, a mother and father flanked by two children, all of them standing shoulder to shoulder in the living room, perfectly still, their faces turned toward the window as though they had been waiting for me. And when my headlights passed over them, they smiled in unison, expressions frozen and unnatural, their eyes unblinking and fixed on my car as it rolled past. None of them waved, none of them moved, and I felt my hands tighten on the steering wheel as a chill crawled up my spine because something about the way they watched me felt less like curiosity and more like recognition. I whispered to myself that it was nothing, that small towns were strange, that maybe this was some local tradition or coincidence amplified by exhaustion and nerves, and I told myself to just keep driving, to get through Blackwood and back onto a main road as quickly as possible. The road narrowed as I continued, twisting deeper into town, and my GPS screen flickered weakly before displaying a distorted, recalculating message that repeated itself for several seconds before the screen went black entirely, leaving me alone with no directions, no signal, and the growing certainty that I had made a mistake by entering this place at all. That was when I saw the inn. The Blackwood Pines Inn appeared through the snowfall like a mirage, its structure looming at the edge of the road, and a flickering neon sign buzzed overhead, casting uneven red and blue light across the snow-covered parking lot. And despite every instinct telling me to keep driving, I pulled in, rationalizing that I needed shelter from the storm and a place to collect myself before continuing on unfamiliar roads. The moment I turned off the engine, the silence returned with crushing force, broken only by the faint buzz of the neon sign and the ticking of my cooling car. And when I stepped inside the inn, warmth enveloped me along with the smell of old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic that I couldn't quite place. Behind the front desk sat an elderly woman with silver hair pulled tightly into a bun, her posture rigid and her smile wide in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. And when she greeted me with a cheerful, "Happy New Year's Eve," the words felt rehearsed, as though she'd been saying them for far longer than a single night. I asked for a room, explaining that the roads were getting bad and that I planned to leave early in the morning. And as she handed me a brass key tagged with the number 217, she told me, in a tone that was gentle yet unsettlingly firm, that no one ever left early, a statement she followed with a smile that made my stomach twist. Before heading upstairs, I noticed the guest book lying open on the counter, and curiosity compelled me to glance at it, only to find that every page was filled with names and signatures, all dated December 31st, spanning years and decades, with not a single entry recorded for January 1st. And when I looked up to ask about it, the woman was already watching me, her eyes sharp and knowing. The hallway on the second floor was long and narrow, the wallpaper peeling in places and the lights dim. And as I unlocked my room and stepped inside, I was struck by how pristine it was. The bed perfectly made, the curtains already drawn back, and the television glowing faintly with static as though it had been waiting for me. From the window, I could see the town square in the distance, where a tall digital clock tower dominated the center, its red numbers glowing brightly through the falling snow, displaying 11:29 p.m. And beneath it, people were beginning to gather, dozens at first, then more, all standing in eerie silence, facing the clock as though awaiting instruction. When my phone buzzed in my hand despite having no signal, my heart nearly stopped, and the message on the screen came from an unknown number, containing only 4 words: "Don't let it reach 0." A warning that sent a surge of panic through me as I tried and failed to respond. The television crackled behind me and switched to a local news broadcast, where the anchor sat stiffly at his desk, smiling with an expression that seemed painfully forced as he reminded residents to remain calm and stay where they were when the countdown began. And when the feed cut to the town square, I saw fear etched across the faces of the crowd, their expressions betraying a truth far darker than celebration. When I tried to leave my room, the hallway was no longer empty, and guests lined the corridor shoulder to shoulder, dressed in party clothes, their faces blank and their eyes following me as I moved. And when someone whispered that I didn't belong, panic took over and I ran, pushing past them, feeling cold hands brush against my jacket. Downstairs, the woman at the front desk told me I was missing the countdown and explained, when I demanded answers, that midnight was when they started over. And before I could ask what that meant, I was already running back into the snow, drawn toward the town square as the clock neared midnight. The chanting began as I reached the crowd, a low synchronized count that rose in volume as the seconds ticked away. And when I grabbed the man at the edge and demanded to know what was happening, he told me through tears that they relived the year over and over again because something fed on it, on their fear and regret. And as the bells began to ring, pain exploded behind my eyes. When I opened them again, I was back in my car, the dashboard clock reading 11:12 p.m., the radio crackling faintly, the Blackwood sign looming ahead, and my phone buzzing with the same message as before, reminding me that I still had time, even as my car rolled forward against my will, and the town welcomed me back for another countdown that would never end.
It was New Year's Eve, and I'd promised myself a quiet night away from the crowds. My friend Murat had called earlier that day with a half-joking suggestion. "Let's go fishing at the pier tonight. Who cares if it's freezing?" I laughed at first. The city would be alive with fireworks, shouting, and car horns. But the thought of being somewhere completely silent, just the two of us and the water, sounded oddly appealing. By the time we arrived at the small wooden pier in Yalova, It was nearly 11 p.m. The air had that sharp winter bite that made every breath sting. Our coats were zipped up, hats pulled low, and gloves thick enough that I could barely feel my fingertips. The pier itself was narrow and rickety, wooden planks weathered dark with age and the dampness of the nearby sea. Beyond the faint glow of a distant street lamp, the water was almost black, a mirror reflecting nothing but itself. We set up our fishing rods in silence at first. Murat fiddled with his line, muttering about knots, while I listened to the occasional distant pop of fireworks from across the city. The sound felt oddly muffled, like it belonged to someone else's world. I half expected the pier to creak under the weight of our boots, but it remained unnervingly still. "You think anyone else will be out here tonight?" I asked. Murat shrugged, his voice low. "Doubt it. Who goes fishing on New Year's Eve at this hour?" I wanted to tell him I'd imagined hearing footsteps earlier, soft and quick, coming from the far end of the pier. But when I looked, the wooden boards were empty. I chalked it up to nerves, or maybe a trick of the fireworks' echoes bouncing off the water. We cast our lines, the silence settling over us like a second skin. At first, it was peaceful, almost comforting. The gentle plop of our hooks hitting the water was the only real sound besides the wind brushing over the waves. But then I noticed the faintest shimmer on the water's surface, right where my line drifted. It wasn't a reflection of fireworks or the distant city lights. It was too uniform, too deliberate, like something luminous was sliding just beneath the surface. I blinked and shook my head. Probably just a trick of my eyes in the dark. Murat didn't notice, and I didn't want to point it out. The night felt heavy, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every small detail. A subtle unease had crept in, like the pier itself was watching us, though I knew that didn't make sense. Then, without warning, the water erupted. A single, piercing streak of white-blue light shot straight up from the depths, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. It rose, sharp and unyielding, like someone had ignited a flare underwater. I heard Murat gasp beside me, a sharp sound that broke the oppressive quiet. It vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. No sound, no ripple, just the faint smell of ozone, like after a storm, lingering in the cold air. We froze. Did you see that?" Murat's voice was barely audible. I don't know what it was," I admitted, my stomach tightening. I wanted to convince myself it was some strange reflection, maybe light from the fireworks hitting a patch of floating debris. But even as I said it, the explanation sounded weak. Too weak. We didn't speak for a few moments. The pier seemed suddenly larger, emptier, as though the light had drawn something out of the night with it. The water was still again, perfectly still, and the silence that followed felt almost oppressive. "Maybe we should go," Murat finally said. His hands were trembling slightly as he reeled in his line. I nodded. Part of me wanted to stay, to watch the water, to see if it happened again. Another part, stronger, told me we were in the wrong place at the wrong time. We gathered our things quickly, moving almost mechanically. I kept glancing back over the edge of the pier, half expecting to see another flare of light or something, someone, emerging from the water. But there was nothing. Only the black, still expanse stretching out toward the horizon. On the way back to the car, the distant fireworks made everything feel surreal, like the world had two layers. One alive and celebratory, the other still, cold and watching. We didn't speak much. I could feel Murat's eyes flicking toward the dark water beside the pier every few steps, and I knew he was thinking the same thing I was. What had that light been? When we reached the car, I tried calling the local police, half hoping someone could explain it. Maybe it was some new experimental light or equipment in the bay. The line rang once before a tired voice answered. "Police, Yalova Station. What is it?" I explained quickly, stumbling over words, and there was silence on the other end. "Sir, we haven't had any reports like that," the voice finally said. "If it happens again, call us. Otherwise, I think you should just stay safe and go home." It was dismissive, almost perfunctory. No investigation, no questions about location, no curiosity. Just the cold reminder that the world was too busy or too unwilling to notice the small, strange things that don't fit neatly into its expectations. I never saw anything like it again. But sometimes, even now, when I close my eyes, I can still feel that moment. The sudden brightness, the shock, the quiet. And I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a random anomaly in nature. Something about it felt intentional, almost like it had been watching us as much as we had been watching it. I've never gone back to that pier. Even on bright, sunny days, I can't walk past without a shiver. I tell myself it was just a light, a weird reflection, a trick of the water. But the truth is, I still don't know. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder, was it something out there? Or something in us that noticed it? Either way, the unease hasn't left, and I suspect it never will.
I went to the New Year's Eve party thinking it would be one of those nights that blurred into memory for all the right reasons. The kind you laugh about months later when someone brings up how crowded it was or how bad the hangover felt the next morning. And for most of the evening, it seemed like that was exactly what it was going to be. Loud and chaotic and full of careless optimism. The kind of energy that only shows up when people believe a calendar change can wash away whatever they don't want to carry forward. The apartment was a converted warehouse loft in New Orleans, all exposed brick and tall windows that overlooked a stretch of street already packed with revelers. And from the moment I stepped inside, I could feel the vibration of the city pressing up through the floor, music from nearby bars mixing with laughter, shouting, and the steady pulse of bass that made it impossible to tell where one party ended and the next began. People were everywhere. Some I knew well, others I'd just met that night, passing drinks from hand to hand, shouting conversations over music, leaning out onto the balcony to watch the crowd below surge and sway like a living thing. At some point, I found myself outside on that balcony, shoulder to shoulder with strangers, looking down at the street where people danced in clusters. Fireworks cracked overhead, and someone was always yelling something incomprehensible with total confidence. And I remember thinking how alive everything felt, how impossible it seemed that anything could go wrong in a moment so thoroughly soaked in celebration. That feeling didn't vanish all at once. It thinned gradually, like warmth leaking from a room through a crack you don't notice until it's too late. The first sign was the sound, a low mechanical roar that didn't belong to the rhythm of the city, something heavier than music and sharper than fireworks. And at first I dismissed it, because that's what people do when reality hasn't caught up to danger yet. But then the roar grew louder and closer, and the mood on the balcony shifted as people leaned forward, confusion replacing excitement, until someone screamed and the street below seemed to erupt into chaos all at once. I saw people scatter in every direction, bodies colliding, drinks spilling, phones dropping to the pavement, and then I saw the truck, large and pale against the dark street, moving with terrifying speed through the crowd, not swerving to avoid people, but adjusting its path to hit them. And the sight was so unreal that my brain struggled to accept it as something actually happening in front of me. The impact sent people flying, others crumpling instantly, and the sound that followed wasn't cheering or music or fireworks anymore, but a raw, collective scream that cut through everything else. Someone behind me shouted that it wasn't an accident, that the driver was aiming, and panic surged through the apartment as people rushed away from the windows, some dropping to the floor, others fumbling for their phones with shaking hands, trying to call loved ones or emergency services that suddenly felt impossibly distant. The music had stopped, replaced by the sound of sobbing, shouting, and the dull thuds from the street below as the truck continued its path until it finally disappeared from view, leaving behind a scene that looked like something torn from a war zone rather than a holiday celebration. We barricaded the door without really discussing it, dragging furniture across the floor, acting on instinct rather than logic. And for a long time, no one spoke in full sentences because none of us had the breath for it. Only fragments of words and half-formed questions that didn't need answers because the truth was already visible in our faces. Some people were injured, not from the truck, but from the chaos. Cuts from broken glass, twisted ankles, shock settling in like a physical weight. And we did what we could while sirens grew louder outside, layering over one another until the night seemed to vibrate with them. When someone finally turned on the television, the footage confirmed what we'd seen but hadn't wanted to believe. The camera sweeping over bodies on the street, emergency responders moving quickly and methodically, police weapons drawn, and the language used by reporters was careful but grim, the kind that strips events down to facts because anything more human would be unbearable. They said the attack was intentional, that the driver had been armed, that explosives had been found, and the word terrorism hovered just beneath the surface, even before anyone dared to say it out loud. Hours passed in a haze, the adrenaline slowly draining and leaving exhaustion and disbelief in its place. And when authorities eventually allowed people to leave, the city outside felt unrecognizable, the same streets now lined with tape and flashing lights, the remnants of celebration crushed into the pavement beneath emergency vehicles. I walked with a small group toward the river, stepping carefully around debris, the smell of smoke and spilled alcohol hanging heavy in the air. And I remember thinking how fragile the boundary was between joy and horror, how easily one could bleed into the other without warning. As we moved through the streets, another sound cut through the night, sharp and unmistakable, followed by screams as people dropped to the ground or ran for cover. And this time, there was no confusion about what it was because we'd all grown up knowing the danger, even if we'd chosen not to think about it on nights like this. Somewhere nearby, someone was firing a gun into the air in celebration or panic or stupidity, and the bullets came down just as they always do, striking the street and the people on it without mercy or intent, turning recklessness into tragedy in a matter of seconds. I saw someone fall not far from me, the crowd surging away as others rushed forward, and later I would learn that similar things were happening across the country that same night, that while one city reeled from a deliberate attack, others were mourning loved ones killed by stray bullets fired during celebrations that were supposed to mark new beginnings. Standing there in the aftermath, watching medics work under flashing lights while people cried into their phones, the idea of a fresh start felt like a cruel joke. By the time the sky began to lighten, the city was quiet in a way I had never experienced, not peaceful, but stunned, as though it were holding its breath. And when we finally left, driving past streets that hours earlier had been alive with music and laughter, I felt older in a way that had nothing to do with time. That New Year's Eve didn't end with cheers or resolutions or kisses at midnight. It ended with the understanding that horror doesn't announce itself, that it can arrive wrapped in celebration, and that sometimes the year doesn't wait to change before it takes something from you that you can never get back.